Hello, it's Dave with URAL Motorcycles, and today we're going to go over how to rebuild a haze brake caliper that was found on URAL Motorcycles from 2014 to 2021. So a 7-year run. There's quite a few of them out there, and as time goes on, they're going to need to be rebuilt. So most of this video will be a tabletop video where I show the basics of getting it apart so you can replace the seals and the piston. But I did want to go over very briefly how to get the caliper off the bike. I'm not going to show the work, but we will talk about it. You're going to want to start with a 5/8 wrench or socket and remove the lock nut that holds the arm for the parking brake cable. Once you've removed this, you can remove the arm off the splines that are inside here, and you can manipulate the spring and the cable and actually remove the arm because you'll need that later. There's also 4 self-tapping or self-threading number 30 Torx head screws over here, and you'll need to remove those. Actually, you could rebuild it with those on, but it might be just more comfortable to work on if these 2 brackets were out of the way that are held on by these 4 screws. Those are a number 30 Torx, and you might want to break those loose if they're corroded in at all. You might want to break them loose before you remove the caliper completely, but it would be better if you remove the top 2 after this bolt was removed so you could access with like a small Torx bit on like a 1/4 inch drive or something. You're also going to want to remove the banjo bolt, but obviously you're going to want to put some rags or something underneath because this will leak fluid and you'll be bleeding the brakes when you complete the job of rebuilding the caliper and reinstall it on the bike. And this bike, some of the banjo bolts have changed over the years. This particular bike, it's using a 17mm head, so you'll need a 17mm wrench or socket. Some of them, though, I've seen are actually 14, and I think there might even be some out there that are 13mm. Now, to remove the caliper after you've removed the banjo bolt and the parking brake cable activation arm here, these 2 are also imperial size of 3/8 hex. So you'll want to use a 3/8 hex tool, either on a socket or just a regular Allen like this, and remove these. Before you remove the bolts, there's 2 little circlips that are on the back of each bolt. They're sitting in a groove there and there. So you're going to want to remove those either with a pry tool or a pair of needle nose pliers, and then you can remove these 2 bolts with a 3/8 hex key. So for our purposes today, we're going to start with a partially disassembled brake caliper. You can see it still has the slider. There are the bolt guides in here, and the bracket that holds the parking brake cable has been removed. Normally it would look like this with the 4 self-tapping screws that are a T30 Torx, and those actually self-thread into the housing. It's not tapped. These bolts actually self-thread, so you're probably going to want to reuse these, but they are available if you need to get new ones. I prefer to remove this part for what is required going forward. It just makes it a little bit easier without those things getting in the way and maybe you know, causing a hassle trying to disassemble the unit. The tools you're going to need to completely disassemble this will be, I like to use the parking brake cable arm for part of the disassembly. So if that's not off the parking brake cable from the bike, remove it. It's pretty easy to remove and put back on, and it's a great tool for part of this process I'll show you in a minute. You're also going to need a screwdriver, a small flat-bladed screwdriver, or a small thin brass drift or punch. That'll be to remove one of the seals. I'll show you that in a moment as well. You're going to need a 8mm wrench to get off the bleeder, and then you're also going to need anywhere between a 13 to a 14mm socket. That is for the one seal that is on the outside of the housing here. And most of the time this will press in by hand, but if you need to get a little bit more on it, a 14mm socket may be required. And then I also have a little selection of picks that I use to get the various O-rings out. The kit itself comes with what you see before you: a brand new piston, 2 flat O-rings for the piston that go inside the housing, inside the caliper body. You have the 4 O-rings that go inside the this part here that holds the sleeve. You've got, it's 2 per, and you get 4 replacements. You get the O-ring that goes on the outside for the mechanical parking brake adjustment. There's also the inner seal, which goes in behind the brake piston. You get a little bit of lube that you'll be using not only on the piston, but on some of these seals as well to install them. And then you get a data sheet that has some tips on completing this rebuild. The brackets are available if they're bent or needs replacing for any reason. The 4 self-tapping screws are also available. If the nylock nut needs to be replaced, which is always recommended, these imperial size nuts are available, as well as the brake arms. The one here is representative of very early 2014, 15, 16, somewhere in there. And then there's a shorter one that was on the newer bikes up to 2021. If you need to expand on this kit here, say you have corroded, these early ones, these sleeves were made of zinc, and over time and use and road debris, they would get pitted or corroded. And if yours need to be replaced, or the bolts, there is an additional kit that is available. And although some of the parts are redundant, the new kit does come with stainless steel sleeves for the caliper body, as well as new bolts that have pre-applied Loctite. The 4 washers that will go inside the caliper body for each of those bushings, and then 2 brand new circlips that go on the end of the bolt. So you're going to want to start by removing the rubber protective boot that's over the parking brake mechanical adjustment. You're going to want to clean this up and reuse it. Then with your 8mm wrench, you're going to want to remove the old bleeder. Most of the time these would be corroded. The kit does come with a new one and a new rubber cap, so why not replace it? You're going to want to remove your pins. Now, if you don't have the secondary kit for a complete rebuild, as long as these are in good shape, there's no pits or burrs that would prevent them from allowing the caliper body to slide back and forth and destroy the O-rings that are in there. If these are in good serviceable condition, just clean them up and then select a pick or tool to help you retrieve the old O-rings. Now with this design, you do not need a piston removal tool to draw the piston out. In fact, you'll see there's not even a cup like you might typically see on other brands of calipers to put a piston removal tool in. So this is where I employ the old parking brake cable arm. I actually put it on the splines, and this is also why I remove all the bracketry here for the parking brake cable, so it's out of my way. Now as I turn the parking brake adjustment or adjuster, you can see it's moving the piston out. So once it gets to a certain point, I think it's past the internal O-rings, you should be able to reach in there and just wiggle it out. There it goes. So now once that's out, you can actually continue to push the arm, the adjuster or the adjusting rod out. You can see the worm drive there that moves in and out when you're adjusting the parking brake sensitivity. There's another O-ring right here that you'll want to remove. That'll get replaced. And then you've got the two flat O-rings in here that you're going to want to replace. You want to be very careful with these not to damage the bore or scratch the smooth finish on the inside of the caliper body. And then lastly, with a brass drift or a small flat-bladed screwdriver, something of that nature, you're not going to be removing this nut here, but very carefully stick a tool up behind that seal, and it's got so it's got the seal lip that actually faces the outside of the body. It's right here on the right flush with this nut. And then the part that seats into the caliper body is actually metal on the bottom and on the sides. So you can get right up behind it, as opposed to prying this way. Just get right up behind it very carefully. Give it a little bump, and you can usually remove these very easily. You can see this one's a little rusted on the outside, a little corroded. That's going to get replaced too. So the next step in the process is to use either brake cleaner or denatured alcohol and give the caliper body a good washing, as well as any other things that you will be reusing, like this rubber dust cap. So I'm going to go wash this up, and I'll be right back. So here I am back with the caliper body. It's all cleaned up. All the machine surfaces inside and out, I used essentially a nylon brush, the equivalent of a soft toothbrush, and I got as much as I could. There was actually a couple areas that looked like the brake pad had been wearing on them, so I cleaned those up a little bit with a file, a very small jeweler's file, to take the burrs off, and inspected it, and everything looks pretty good. My parking brake adjuster I cleaned very, very well and got all the old remnants of grease and everything else off that I could. So we're going to start with that first. You can see the piston lube here. You don't need a lot of it, but you just want to, you're going to coat the O-rings to help them seat and slide on, and make sure they don't get torn when they're installed. Next, we're going to go to the caliper body, and before we install this seal, we're going to lubricate the worm drive down in there. And the reason we're going to lubricate this part as opposed to that is because when you insert it, you don't want to contaminate the area where the brake fluid will come in contact with it. The yellow piston lube is actually, I called Hayes Brakes to confirm this, but so this is compatible with brake fluid, but it's not very good for an area that's going to be exposed to contaminants from outside. So even though this seal is in here, the end of the shaft, as it's adjusted over the years or just from riding, you could actually have something go inside. So you want to have something that's more of a standard grease. The tech that I talked to actually said a silicone grease or something of that nature is great. I actually have a grease here that I use. This is a non-melting pure synthetic lubricant. It's good for most brake components. We're going to load up in here too. This will keep the worm drive moving in and out freely for years to come. Next is going to be the seal. I keep calling it an O-ring, but it's a seal. And this is where your 14 millimeter is going to come into play. These actually seat pretty well with just finger pressure. But if you want to make sure that it's seated fully, I actually just set the body on a 14 millimeter socket to make sure that it's fully seated in there. So now that we've got the O-ring on this end and the seal on this end, you can insert the worm drive adjuster. While you hold it, you can actually start pulling it through, and you want to twist it counterclockwise until it's as far down in that bore as it will go. So next we're going to install the two flat piston seals, and again we're going to go back to our piston lube and just coat them a little bit. You want to make sure that they're both in there seated flat into the caliper body and they're not twisted or bent, and that they're fully seated in the groove. Now you can take your piston, and it doesn't really matter which way it goes in. And I just lubricate the leading edge that I'm going to sounds like there's a party next door. The end I'm going to start with, and I start working it down evenly. And I don't have the bleeder in so the air can expel. So when the seals are new, it's a little firm to get in there, but it can be done with basic hand pressure. Now that that's in, we can move to the pins that slide in the body. So obviously there's 4 O-rings, and those are going to, just like the piston O-rings, they're going to be placed in the body on either end, on both sides. Make sure they're sitting flush in the groove. Give your pins a little coating, and then you can push those through. Make sure they slide around easy. Then you can put your cap back on. And install the rubber cap for your bleeder valve. Make sure it's facing the right way. It'll actually cover the bleeder. And install your bleeder valve. Okay, you've successfully rebuilt the caliper and it's ready to be reassembled onto the bike. And the rear brake system bled with some new pads, and you'll be good to go for a long time. I appreciate you watching, and if you have any questions or comments, you can leave them in the comments section down below, or you can always reach out and contact us at info@imz-ural.com. Thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you next time.